This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Series, which is Mindflex, and we're doing part 2. The theme that we're covering in these 3 classes is is God's plan for human history and the Jewish people's role in the story. So if you saw the first class, we did World Perfect, which is basically about the impact of monotheism, the idea of one God, on morality and values. And now we're going to do the flip side of this, which is actually very much connected. If you saw the first class, great, because it flows right into this one. And if not, still, it's a great stand on its own class, which is called Why the Jews. Again, it's a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So today we're going to be looking at the why of anti-Semitism. What's behind this phenomenon? And this isn't just a nice historical, theological, philosophical overview. Anti-Semitism is alive and well and exploding exponentially in ways we have not seen since the Holocaust in the United States, for sure. You know, with all the civil unrest that's happened recently in America after the killing of George Floyd, we see, in Fairfax in California, Jewish stores targeted, and not just targeted for looting, as many stores were targeted, but with anti-Semitic and anti-Israel graffiti on them, attacks on Jews everywhere. One thing we appreciate about anti-Semitism is that it's a universal phenomenon. There was a Harvard math professor in the 1960s. His name was Tom Lear. I think he's still alive today. He started out in New York. Now he's out in California, I believe, in his 90s. He used to write very funny satirical songs about the situation in the world. He wrote a song called National Brotherhood Week, which I guess was a week that used to exist in America. And one of the verses of the song went like this.
Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews, but during...
And the crowd laughs, and a lot of the audience is Jewish. But the question is why? And again, the why is not just an interesting philosophical question. It's extremely relevant. As I said, the anti-Semitism is everywhere now, rising to levels unseen since the Holocaust. So we need to get to the bottom of this phenomenon so we can ensure that what happened to the Jewish people between 1939 and 1945 in Europe never happens to us, our children, or our children's children. This is why this presentation is so important, because we're going to be looking at the Jewish understanding of what really drives anti-Semitism and also what, therefore, is really the solution to anti-Semitism. Now, if you ask the experts, the historians, the sociologists, why there's anti-Semitism in the world, they'll generally give one of the following 7 explanations. One is economics. Jews have too much money, power, control. This is a very common one today. Number 2 is chosen people. We think we're better, we're special, no one likes an elitist. Number 3 is scapegoat. We're always in the right place at the wrong time. Blame the Jews for your problems. Number 4 is Zionism. This one is, of course, the number 1 source of anti-Semitism today. Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, the occupation, the apartheid walls, Israel's illegitimacy, its genocidal policies. Number 5 is outsiders. We're different. We're a fifth column, a minority you can never trust. Jews are never really loyal. Number 6 is the Christian accusation of deicide, Christ killer. And number 7 is the one used by Hitler himself, which is the notion of we're a different and therefore inferior race. So pretty much any so-called explanation for anti-Semitism will almost certainly fall into one of these 7 categories. But we need to look at these through the lens of objective truth and fact and eliminate the excuses so we only can focus on what the cause is. Let's define our terms. What's a cause versus an excuse? Maybe some of you remember that cartoon Calvin and Hobbes. Why didn't Calvin do his homework? Now, Calvin is a 7-year-old with a hyperactive imagination. And here he's trying to explain to the principal all these ridiculous stories of aliens and dinosaurs. You can see the principal's dealt with Calvin before and doesn't seem too convinced. So these things have nothing to do with why Calvin's homework wasn't done. When we deal with the reality of anti-Semitism, we have to keep the same thing in mind, that there are millions, even tens of millions of people who believe any number of things about us that have no basis in reality, but we can't stop doing or change things we were never doing in the first place. What we need to do, is like what the principal's trying to do, is get to the cause. What's the real reason? In this case, it's Calvin watching TV. Look at how old this cartoon is. It's like PPP, pre-plasma period. Look at that television and the cartoon. But we need to find the thing that is truly causing the anti-Semitism so we can change it or stop it, so we can get rid of this phenomenon once and for all. So now we're going to look through the microscope of facts and reality, go through each of these 7 supposed explanations for anti-Semitism. We're going to get rid of all of the ones that are excuses and be left with, at the end of this presentation, a mere 45 minutes or so from now, what is truly driving anti-Semitism. And just like a good doctor, if a patient is sick, you can't get distracted by the symptoms. You got to go for the cause, and what we need to do individually and collectively as the Jewish people to once and for all end this phenomenon. Very important presentation. Let's begin at the beginning. The association of Jews and money, economic theory, money and power go together. Where does this first begin? It goes all the way back to medieval Europe. By the way, these are Renaissance period wood carvings. You should see, by the way, that the traditional sign for the Jew in medieval Europe, we're all used to Hitler's yellow star, but it was actually this circle, which is a coin sign. Association of Jews and money. Notice this guy over here on the left with the ridiculous nose and the feet of a bird. That's the devil. The devil and the Jew is always going to be the same thing. The association of the Jews and money first really begins in the 13th century when the Catholic Church in 1215 in the Fourth Lateran Council forbade usury, lending money at interest. This, by the way, is taken from Judaism, this specific prohibition. Now, by the way, if you don't lend money at interest, there's no banking. If there's no banking, there's no economic development. So someone's got to be forced to do it. And since the Jew, in the mind of the church, was already going to hell for killing Jesus, we'll get to that in a few minutes, we'll force him to lend money. But how do we know it's not the cause of anti-Semitism? First, Jews are forced into doing. Most Jews didn't do it. Even Jews who didn't lend money are still hated. Even when the Italian Lombard bankers later in the Renaissance start lending money at significantly higher rates of interest than the Jews in violation of the church's prohibition, they're not hated. So clearly this is not the cause of the anti-Semitism. But the real explosion of the association of Jews with money and power is later in history, around the year 1900, 1901, with the publication of the world's most famous forgery, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Maybe you're familiar with that book. It was originally published in Russian by the secret police of the Tsar of Russia, called the Black 100s, which is like the scariest name for any police force I could think of. And it's supposedly the secret minutes of a meeting that takes place once every 100 years when the rabbis get together and the heads of the Jewish world to plan Jewish control of the world for the next century. Now, how do you know it's a forgery besides we know it's a forgery? Anyone who thinks that 10 rabbis in a room could agree on anything knows nothing about the Jewish people. Yet after the Bible and the Quran, there are probably more versions of this book in print than any other book on the planet Earth. I actually have a friend who grew up in Kobe, Japan. There's a small Jewish community there. And he told me it's a bestseller in Japan. He told me this years ago, but not because the Japanese are anti-Semitic, because Asians generally aren't, but rather because they believe it's true, the Japanese, and they want to know how the Jews are doing it so they can copy it. But how do we know it's not true? Couple of examples. First of all, May 1939, they made a movie about this story called The Voyage of the Damned. Hitler takes a boat called the St. Louis, sticks almost 1,000 Jews on it, and sends it off to go to the West, go to America, go to South America, go anywhere over there. Now imagine it's a boat full of Rothschilds and Reichmans and billionaire, powerful, wealthy, connected people. How hard would it be for such people to find a port of refuge? I work with a lot of wealthy people when I'm guiding and stuff. They snap their fingers, the door's open. What happened to the ship? It sails around, goes from port to port and sails around the Atlantic for weeks and weeks and weeks, and no one takes any of these people in. And eventually it goes back to Europe, and many of them die in the Holocaust. But more than that, today Jews in America are like the highest income earning bracket in the United States. But that's a relatively modern phenomenon. Most of us have grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who came to America with a shirt on their back. The vast majority of Jews living in Eastern Europe and the places where Hitler decimated with the Holocaust were at best middle class, and many of them were quite actually poor. But more than that, I mean, we see poor Jews are hated just as much as rich Jews in history. In 1935, Hitler gets to power in 1933. In 1935, he issues what's called the Nuremberg Laws, which robbed Jews of all the civil and economic progress they had made in the last century. You know, any public office they held, bank accounts, they're thrown out of schools, they can't vote, they lose their citizenship. So the threat the Jew poses is economic or political, and it's neutralized through legislation. Why does he have to go and then actually kill the Jews? Because clearly in Hitler's mind, the threat the Jew poses is something much greater than that. So we'll put that one on the side. People may believe it. A lot of people believe it. It's circulated around the world everywhere, but clearly it has no basis in reality. Number two is chosen people. Now, it's natural that people don't like people who think they're superior to others. By the way, as we'll see, chosen people isn't about superiority. But it is true that we Jews have always viewed ourselves to be a unique nation with a very special responsibility, and maybe that could engender a certain level of hostility. And we generally chose to look, dress, and live differently than other people. But along comes the Enlightenment, the Napoleonic Wars, and the walls of the ghettos are broken down, primarily by Napoleon himself, as we'll get to. Jews are let out of the ghettos, and they run to embrace Western civilization, often at the expense of their Jewish identity. We'll leave that behind or minimize it. And the Reform movement is founded in the early 19th century to create a version of Judaism that would allow Jews to comfortably integrate into Western society specifically, and German society, which was the ultimate high culture, more than anywhere else. And the first thing that these Jews, the Reform movement drops, is the notion of Jews being a separate nation, a separate people with a separate mission or a separate destiny or a different homeland. They said, we're not going back to Israel. Germany is our Israel. Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, that's our Jerusalem. Today you read these quotes and it makes you feel kind of sick in the pit of your stomach. But again, we're looking in hindsight. So here a bunch of Jews says, we're not special, we're not different, we have no unique mission, we're going to merge with Germany. Does the anti-Semitism go away? I would say it goes quiet, like a fault line, goes dormant for a while, but then it explodes more than 100 years later in the greatest explosion of the Holocaust in the mid-20th century already. But more than that, everyone thinks they're chosen or special. The red sun is in the center of the flag of Japan because the word for Japan means the land of the rising sun. They're closest to the Pacific, to the gods. The word for China in Chinese is traditional. It means center of the universe. And traditionally, the word for non-Chinese is monkey or barbarian. Not too PC, by the way. Christianity and Islam both believe theologically in what's called supersessionism. Yeah, God may have chosen the Jews, but the Jews blew it, and God chose us instead. So every nation, every faith thinks they're chosen or special, but only we're hated for it. And even when we drop the notion of being chosen or special, the hatred doesn't go away. It's like you got a patient, the doctor's treating him, he's got the sores on his skin, he gives him a cream, and it's not getting better. He isn't diagnosing the disease correctly. It's another excuse. Let's keep going. Scapegoat theory. By the way, the term scapegoat comes from Judaism originally. It's the goat during the temple period. During Yom Kippur, the high priest would symbolically confess the sins of the Jewish people onto a goat, which would be sent out to the Judean desert, Ma'ale Adumim area, and thrown off a cliff. It's a symbolic act. So, but the idea of scapegoating is, we know, taking someone who is innocent and blaming them for something they didn't do. Why? To distract attention from who's really guilty. Often it's state-sponsored. We're not responsible. These Jews are. By the way, this one is true. Jews are absolutely always scapegoated. But scapegoating is by definition, as we just saw, an excuse. But there's something we have to focus on when we look at the concept of scapegoating. Let me illustrate. Here's Hitler speaking at a rally in 1935. By the way, the motto at the top over here is, in German, the Jews are our misfortune, which is the byline of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. Imagine every issue of the newspaper says, Der Stürmer, the Jews are our misfortune. And you see Hitler ranting and raving about how bad the Jews are for Germany specifically and the world in general. What's the crowd's reaction? They think it's great. Fantastic. Imagine he stands up and says, we got to fight against the ultimate enemy of the fatherland of Germany, the midgets. The midgets are our misfortune. Now, what's the crowd's reaction now? Adolf is barking mad. He needs a uniform with sleeves that tie around the back and an office with padded walls and no door handle on the inside. Why, when they hear about Jews, does it make sense, and they hear about midgets, they think he's totally crazy? Why? Jews are such a big proportion of German population? What percentage of Germany is Jewish before the Holocaust? 0.6%. The point I'm trying to illustrate is when you're going to scapegoat someone, ideally you want to pick someone that people already love to hate. And that's exactly what Hitler's doing. He didn't just pull Jews out of a bag. He's focusing on what exists for centuries before, which is Christian anti-Semitism, deicide, Christ killer. This is my personal favorite. I'm being sarcastic now. I have to tell you a little anecdote personally. When my great-grandmother bought some buildings in Brooklyn, well over 100 years ago, that my grandmother got, and then she passed on to my mother today. But when we were little kids, we lived in my grandmother's building near Prospect Park in Brooklyn on 4th Street, in a neighborhood that now is very gentrified and very nice. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. It was a very working class, middle class neighborhood. When we were living there, it was all Irish and Italian Catholic. We were the only Jews on the street. And I remember, by the way, my brother, who's only 16 months older than I am, we used to always play down the street at this kid, Joseph Viglia. All these kids went to St. Saviour's, a parochial school, and he was an Italian Catholic kid. I remember we'd be playing at his house. It was dinner time. His mother would say, "Joseph, send the Christ killers home. It's time for dinner." I'm like 5, 6 years old at the time. I also remember when he was 7 years old, and he had his birthday party, invites all the kids on the block except for us. And my brother's like, "Let's go see why we're not invited." And I'm like, "I don't want to see why we're not invited." And he drags me down the street. They live 1 floor up. We go up the stairs. My brother goes to the door. I'm so scared. I'm like standing on the stairway halfway down with my eyes at floor level looking at the door. My brother knocks on the door. Suddenly it goes all quiet inside. They open the door up a crack, and you see Joseph is there, and everyone's behind him. And my brother's like, "Why don't we get invited to the party?" And Joseph's like, "Oh, we ran out of invitations." And my brother's a smart guy. He's a doctor today, He didn't buy that one. So he swings the door open. What's in back of him on the wall? This. And he yells, and everyone's there. The kids, the parents, they're all looking. "You killed our God." And he slams the door in my brother's face, and I go running home and hide. I'm so scared. I was like freaked out, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And also didn't make sense. I'm like 5, 6 years old. And I'm thinking, like, God, Superman, it took kryptonite to kill Superman. How did you kill God with 2 boards and 3 nails? But there's so many ridiculous, irrational aspects of the Christ killer accusation. First of all, like, when was Jesus born and when did he die? Well, we're not sure any of this stuff historically, but from the year 1 to the year 32 CE. Like, when should Christianity be most angry if Jews are responsible? Like, right after his death. Okay, Christianity isn't a major world religion in the 1st century, but when it becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century under Constantine the Great, okay, first item of business, let's pay those Jews back. Like, give you another example, like American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Who wins? North. When's the South most upset? 1866. Imagine you land in Florida this winter and this is what you see. Well, you can't show the Confederate flag anywhere anymore now. Forget that one. But the point is, time dulls all pain. When should the Christian world be most angry? As soon after the event as possible. Yet, when does the accusation of Christ killer first appear, and when is it unleashed? Used to unleash massive violence against Jews 1,000 years after the event during the Middle Ages. That's crazy stuff, but more than that. By the way, theologically, why was Jesus born and why did he die? Christianity, unlike Judaism, doesn't believe in tshuva, repentance. You're born in sin, you die in sin. The only thing that saves you is believing that Jesus died for your sins. He is the sacrifice, the suffering lamb. So if he hadn't died, we'd all be getting that big barbecue because there'd be no salvation. Okay, that's interesting point number one. But who killed him? If you look in the gospel, which is hardly a pro-Jewish document, especially Matthew, you see it's the Romans. The Romans arrest him. The Romans try him. The Romans flog him. The Romans crucify him. Okay, there was some Jews involved in the plot, if you read the gospel in Matthew. But let's split the blame 50-50 with the Romans. We get all the blame. They get the church named after them. the Roman Catholic Church. That's really weird. By the way, in 1965, Pope Paul the 23rd, I believe, in Vatican II, the most significant statement made about Jews in the history of 2,000 years, he says, first of all, only a few Jews were responsible for the plot against Jesus to get him crucified, and no Jew alive today, almost 2,000 years later, can be held responsible. Now, the Pope is infallible. He's perfect. Right? When the Pope forgives us for something that we didn't do in the first place, which had to be done theologically and from their perspective anyway, does anything change? No, nothing. It's all crazy excuses. But we look deeper into Christian anti-Semitism, it gets even wilder. For instance, what's unique about kosher meat? Besides what kind of animal you can eat, like no pork, and you got to chef the animal, you can't consume any blood. So what are Jews accused of starting in 1144 in Norwich, England? You can see, here's a picture of it. Here you see the Jews with their little circles, their coin signs, with their ridiculous hats and their stupid Jewish names, kidnapping a Christian baby. Here's the poor child. They're making incisions in his body and draining his blood into a bowl. Blood libels. Why do Jews need blood? This is a multiple choice question, so don't answer yet. By the way, in Hebrew, that's called an American test, a Nivchan Amerikai. Why do Jews need blood? A, it's the chief ingredient in matzah. B, all Jewish men menstruate and need a monthly blood transfusion. C, all Jews as a punishment for killing Jesus suffer from hemorrhoids, and the only known cure for hemorrhoids in medieval Europe is Christian babies' blood. D, Jewish boys, when they're circumcised, lose so much blood they have to drink Christian babies' blood to replenish the loss. What's the correct answer? E, all of the above. And none of this has anything to do with reality. And it's also known as transference. Because what's the central ritual in a Catholic Mass? I'm sure most of you don't go to church and don't know this, but it's transubstantiation. The priest changes the wine and the wafer into the body and the blood of Jesus. In the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, in the 13th century, the church says this is not a symbolic act. When you drink that blood, when you eat that wafer, we're frozen here. You're drinking Christ's blood. And let's see if we can get this to move. There we go. And eating his body. So what are Jews immediately accused of, starting in the 13th century in Belitz in Switzerland? Here you can see the Schweizer Deutsch, the Swiss-German graphic novel version of it. Jews are accused of breaking into the church. Here you can see. These are the communion wafers that are used in the church service that symbolize his body. Taking it to the synagogue. Notice the fake Hebrew on the tablets. The wafers are being stabbed and they're screaming and blood is pouring out of them. They're dividing them up to further torture and burn them, thus reenacting his death. But thank God the Christians come, the Jews are arrested, they are beheaded, they are tortured with hot tongs. In the end, the remaining Jews are burned alive. In the end, you can see Jewish body parts hanging off the church. The Jews are dead, the crackers are returned to the church, the angels are singing, and everyone's happy. We hate the Jews because they torture crackers. You can almost laugh at that, but thousands of Jews in Belitz in Switzerland were all sentenced to death based on evidence extracted through torture from a few people and then put in a giant house especially created for that purpose and burned alive, as were many Jews after that. This is all insane. It gets crazier and crazier. What is the most non-kosher animal that you could think of? The pig. So what's the animal always associated with Jews? The pig. And here you see all kinds of mostly Renaissance period wood carvings that are called Judensau, which is basically female Jewish pig. This particular one you see in close-up is an engraving on the bridge outside the Judengasse, outside the ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany. That thousands of German Gentiles are crossing and seeing this image outside the ghetto every day. Is the classic image. Here you can see a big, ugly female pig. Here's the devil as a Jew. You can see the Jewish signs. These guys are usually called rabbis. Here you can see that one is suckling from the pig, and here the pig is defecating into the Jew's mouth and he's eating it. Oh my God. When Hitler stands up centuries later and says the Jew is subhuman evil, enemy of humanity, and he's building on these incredible lies and excuses, there's no wonder he's able to do what he's able to do in the Holocaust. But none of this has anything to do with reality. Let's keep moving. Okay, the Jews are outsiders. By the way, the number one reason we hate most people in this world is because they're different. Dislike of the different. And it's true that throughout our history, we generally chose to look, dress, eat, live differently, separately from the non-Jews. And those differences could engender a certain level of hostility and suspicion, like they often do. It's just, unfortunately, human nature. But then along comes Napoleon Bonaparte, who is the great emancipator of the Jewish people. And he breaks down the walls of the ghettos and offers the Jews civil rights in Western Europe. He sends his emissary, Count Stanislav de Clermont-Tonnerre, to the Jews of Europe, and he says to the Jews as individuals, everything, but to the Jews as a people, nothing. If you want to stay as a separate community with your own laws, don't expect anything. But if you want to be loyal Frenchmen or loyal citizens of any country, you get the rights and privileges. He even convenes in 1806 and 1807 an assembly of Jewish notables and a great Sanhedrin. He puts 100 rabbis in this room, mostly from France and Italy. These are all, by the way, Orthodox rabbis. This is before the Reform movement. And he asks them a series of questions about Jewish identity and Jewish loyalty. The rabbis do a great dance around the questions. But it works, because by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, Jews get civil rights everywhere in Europe. Some places like Switzerland, much later than others in Spain, but much later. But Jews are finally emancipated. And what do Jews run to do? They run to often leave their Judaism behind and to embrace Western culture. And by the way, from this period of time onward, in the 19th century, in Western Europe, open, violent anti-Semitism seems to go on a big decline. If you ask a sociologist in 1850 what's going to be with anti-Semitism in 1950, he probably would have said there's not going to be any anti-Semitism in 1950 because there's not going to be any Jews. That seemed to be what was happening, but anti-Semitism wasn't going away. It was just going to sleep. The one little glitch on the radar screen, which really shows that being like the non-Jew doesn't help at all. The anti-Semitism doesn't go away. It just changes its tactic and comes back from a different side, is going to be the Dreyfus Affair, the most famous trial of the 19th century. Here you got the hero of the story, so to speak, 34-year-old French Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, highest-ranking Jew in the French army. Remember, Jews were emancipated in the late 18th century, and then during Napoleon's time, they could join the French army. They could even be officers in Germany. That will take much longer. They'll be able to join the army, but they can't be officers until World War I in the German army. By the way, Adolf Hitler, who got 2 Iron Crosses, I believe, got his first one, highest German military award, from his German Jewish commanding officer. Dreyfus is a totally assimilated Jew and a totally loyal Frenchman. France was arch enemy of the Germans, and the French army and the French government, although seemingly open and tolerant and on the books, giving Jews equal rights, were still deeply anti-Semitic. Dreyfus is found guilty of being a German spy, using forged evidence his defense attorney was not even allowed to see. He is publicly court-martialed in Paris. So you can see the scene of the court-martial, they're breaking his sword. He's sent off to Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana near Brazil. By the way, he was brought back 2 more times, found guilty all 3 times. He stayed in the French, eventually he was pardoned and stayed in the French army. But why am I telling you the story? Because at this trial, which was a huge media event at the time, watching the trial is a 34-year-old Hungarian Jewish playwright and journalist, also very assimilated, living in Vienna, Austria. The most cultured city in Europe was probably Vienna. His name is Theodor Herzl. And he's watching the trial in horror because the crowd is screaming as Dreyfus is being court-martialed. The crowd is screaming not death to Dreyfus the traitor, but the mot juif, kill the Jews. And he writes in his diary, Herzl, where is this happening? In France, 100 years after Jews get civil rights. And for him, it's this whoa, big moment that the Jew can twist himself into any shape he likes to try and answer the accusation of the non-Jew. You hate me because I'm different. I'll become just like you. Does the anti-Semitism go away? No. It just changes its excuse and comes back from a different angle. But Dreyfus will therefore join a very Eastern European movement called Zionism, believing, as all early Zionists did, that the solution to the Jewish question, the answer to anti-Semitism, is going to be a Jewish state. We can't live amongst them, but we have our own country with our own army and our own passport and our own embassy and our own capital, then they'll finally leave us alone. Now, Herzl died in 1904, and sadly we see, fast forward to 2020, not only has Zionism not proven, don't get me wrong, it's a great thing, the Jewish state, but not only is Zionism not proven to be the solution to anti-Semitism, it's the number 1 excuse in the world for hating Jews. And you can see all these images here. These are not Arab states always, like Jews and Nazis, the sickest, we'll get back to that one later, the 6 lines of a Jewish star turning into the 6 lines of a swastika. But that brings us to this whole notion that if only, Israel were to be, nicer to the Palestinians or disappear, then there'd be no anti-Semitism. By the way, the big question we have to ask is, what does Israel have to do with Jew hate in France or America? I mean, what? A Christian does something to someone somewhere in one part of the world and Christians are attacked somewhere else. There's something weird about that. But the notion that it's Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, the occupation, the apartheid walls, Israel's rejection of peace is all nonsense. We see that from the very beginning, this is not a class on Middle East history and the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but the Arab world has rejected the Jewish state from its very beginning. Even before a Jewish state even comes into existence, it's under attack. And as soon as it comes into existence, it's under constant attacks and terrorism. We know that in 1947, the UN votes November 29, 1947, to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Had the Arabs accepted it, along with the birth of a Jewish state, would have been born an Arab state. Called Palestine, I don't know, but it would have been born along with the Jewish state. They reject it and try and destroy Israel. Jordan will move in and illegally occupy that West Bank, Judea, Samaria, that whole area, and Jerusalem, the old city, and Egypt will illegally occupy the Gaza Strip. There's no UN resolutions back then condemning them. So if the occupation is the root of the problem, why are they attacking us before occupying that territory? They try and destroy us again in 1967, and Israel wins an amazing 6-day war victory, gets the territory from these people who are trying to destroy us, immediately offers to give it back to the Arabs, and the Arab world rejects it. The Arab League in August 1967, no peace, no negotiation, and no recognition of Israel. And we see that this has been the case over and over again. Let's just go back to that for a second, get ahead of myself there. I'm not doing a class on this now, but the simple thing is it's never been about creation of a Palestinian state. It's always been about the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size. But we see that what is the connection between what's going on in Israel and anti-Semitism? And by the way, if you watch the statistics from the Anti-Defamation League, you'll notice the biggest spikes in anti-Semitism around the world will always take place when there's a conflict in Israel, like a war in Gaza or something like that. But it's all an excuse. Last but not least, we have the one used by Adolf Hitler, which is the racial theory of anti-Semitism, that Jews are a different and therefore inferior race, and Hitler and the Nazi propaganda machine will create this whole image, these images of Jews, these stereotypes, incredibly ugly looking people here, and this pseudoscientific equipment to measure Jews and show their inferiority. The Jews have a smaller cranium, a smaller skull, and they're mentally and physically inferior. And this is all nonsense. Not only that, there's no such thing as a Jewish race. Jews come in all size, shapes, and colors. So guys, we can cross all of this stuff out. We ran through that, but if you look at it seriously, none of it has any basis in reality, and certainly none of it can begin to explain the level of hostility being directed at the Jews. People may believe these things, but they have no basis in reality. And not only that, if you're looking at this, you got to ask yourself a question that's really interesting. None of this also has any relationship to Judaism. There's nothing Jewish about hating Jews. What's the most famous diary from the Holocaust? Everyone knows it's Anne Frank. So Anne Frank, we know, is a German girl. His father was a businessman. When Hitler gets to power, the family moves to Holland because Otto, the father, had business interests there. They end up hiding in an attic as she's a young girl. Eventually, someone rats on them. The Dutch did a lot of turning Jews in. Till today, no one's exactly sure. There's much speculation. And she will die of typhus in Bergen-Belsen a month before liberation. The only family member to survive is the father, who finds the diary, publishes it. It's published in like over 100 languages. It's the best-known book about the Holocaust. Anne Frank is not a religious girl. She has minimum Jewish education. Look what she writes while hiding in that attic about what is the real cause of anti-Semitism. Who knows? It might even be our religion, from which the world and all peoples learn good, and for that reason and that reason only do we now suffer. We can never become just Netherlanders or just English or representatives of any country for that matter. We will always remain Jews. Interesting. Now, the Diary of Anne Frank is turned into a Broadway show. You have to change the diary into dialogue. There is no way that the guy, it's probably some Jewish playwright who's not so connected Jewishly, there's no way that guy is going to put this heavy, very Jewish-specific line into the play. So how does it appear in the Broadway show? Well, one day it's one group and the next day another. Really? Like Hitler sitting there going, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and now it's time for the Juden to go? That's it? 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children are slaughtered in factories of mass murder because it's just some random thing? Come on. There's something weird going on here. And the time we have left, we now want to pull back and begin by looking first, what is unique about anti-Semitism? Jews do not have a monopoly on hatred in this world, but there are aspects of anti-Semitism that stand out like a flashing red light that we only see in Jew hate. And then we're going to get to what Judaism says. All excuses aside is the real cause. So first of all, we got to appreciate anti-Semitism is different. Look at Dr. Bernard Lewis, who just passed away about a year ago at the age of 102. He wrote a book called Semite and Anti-Semite, and in it he writes, hatred of Jews has many parallels and yet is unique in its persistence and its extent, its potency and its virulence, its terrible final solution. Conventional prejudice and persecution can be very terrible, but they differ from anti-Semitism as does conventional from nuclear war. Meaning the world is full of racist, bigots, and intolerant people, but Jew hate is different, and it's far more intense. What sets it apart? Begin by looking at the word, which, by the way, shouldn't really be hyphenated, even though your spell check will try and stick a hyphen between anti and Semitism. Who created the word? What does it mean? A lot of people are confused about it. Anti-Semitism, like I've had Muslim students on campuses tell me that I'm the anti-Semite. Like, I am Eastern European, I'm Jewish, I'm a religion, I'm Slavic, I hate Arabs, they're Middle Eastern Semitic people, I'm the anti-Semite. Smokescreen, not true. The word was created by a German racial thinker in the late 19th century. In 1879, his name was Wilhelm Marr. Marr, this is after Darwinian evolutionary theory came out in 1858. This is when eugenics and racial theory started to appear. He wanted to make hatred of Jews sound more racial and scientific and less religious, so he coins this phrase in a book he writes in 1879 called The Victory of Germandom over Judaism. But in every dictionary in the world, it means one thing and one thing alone, what you see on your screen, prejudice or hostility towards Jews and Jews alone. If you hate an Arab, you are not an anti-Semite. And for more than 100 years, it remains the only form of racial or religious intolerance that has its own word to describe it. Think about it. You hate a black person, what are you? A racist. You hate an Asian, what are you? A racist. You hate a Christian, what are you? There's no word. Only Jew hate has to have its own word. That should get us thinking there's something unique about this hatred. And it's not just the word. Look at what Edward Flannery, Catholic priest, says in his book, The Anguish of the Jews. He says that as historian of anti-Semitism looks back over the millennia of horrors he's recorded, an inescapable conclusion emerges. Anti-Semitism is different because of its longevity and consistency. It is the longest continuous hatred on the planet Earth. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis. Number two that sets it apart, universality. And unlike hatred of other peoples, hatred of us is not linked to our relationship with one race, one people, one religion, one nation, one tribe, one geographic area. Wherever we have gone in significant numbers, anti-Semitism has followed the most universal hatred. Like Tom Lear said in that song we saw at the beginning, this group hates that group and that group hates this group, but everyone hates the Jews. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all people are anti-Semites, but we see it's a universal hatred. Number three that sets it apart is the intensity. The dictionary definition might be prejudice or hostility, but it's a lot worse than that. If the worst thing that happened to us is they made jokes about us, we couldn't get into a couple of country clubs and universities, that used to be in America. Early mid-20th century kind of stuff. But it's much worse than that. It's one unendingly long list of vicious, violent hatred, of persecution, expulsion, economic and physical marginalization, ghettoization, rape, pillage, beating, up to what's the worst thing you could do to people you hate? Kill them. What do you call killing an entire people? Genocide. Who invented that word? A Polish-Jewish refugee, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who's the father of the concept of crimes against humanity and international law. Fleeing from Poland to England during World War II, he writes, as a crime happening in Europe, there's no word to describe, and he creates that word genocide. Even that word had to be created to describe the unique intensity of anti-Semitism. And last but not least, what sets it apart is everything we've been looking at until now, the confusion surrounding it. I mean, think about it. You ask a white suprematist to put on a whiteboard why he doesn't like black people. He'll write 5 or 6 horrible things that they supposedly do. But you ask Jew haters to put on a whiteboard why they hate Jews, they'll fill up 15 whiteboards. I hate them because they're capitalist, communist, warlike, passive, different, the same, strong, weak, rich, poor, dominant, lazy, servile, aggressive. What's weird about the list, guys? A, it doesn't end, and B, it contradicts itself. Professor Michael Curtis at Rutgers University said it unbelievably well. Anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate, the Jew's that. What? Guys, this is crazy. At this point, some of the biggest experts, and I've heard them speak, will say, there's just no explanation for it. It's a disease, it's a sickness, it's an irrational thought process. And back of the image here, you see where it says why the Jews is like an endlessly long list of excuses for hating Jews, because it would indicate that too many excuses means there's no real cause. And if we had stopped here, that would be really depressing. We've been trying to educate the world forever, but we just don't do this stuff, but that don't seem to work. They always come up with another excuse. So let's switch gears now and let's focus on what Judaism says. All excuses aside is the real cause. And we're not going to do this through so many Jewish sources as we're going to do it through the words and the mind of the greatest modern and worst anti-Semite in modern history, Adolf Hitler. By the way, this man, a lot of things you could say about him, but he knew how to get a crowd going, that he was able to shape what was culturally, technologically, and scientifically the most advanced country into the world into this sycophantic mass hysteria and directed towards total war and total annihilation. This guy, we have to appreciate about Hitler. Number one, he is a man of greatness. Now, I'm going to qualify that. I'm a historian, a student of history. To do great good or great evil in this world, you got to have great potential. To be a Roosevelt or an Abraham Lincoln, you're a Churchill on one hand, or a Mao Zedong, or a Stalin, or a Hitler on the other, you got to have great potential. That's number one. Number two mistake we make is we call people like this guy crazy. I'll tell you, to do great things, you can't be insane. Hitler was clearly more neurotic than most people, but he's not crazy. He's a man very clear thinking, which is the third mistake we often make with people like Hitler, is we don't take them seriously. And I'll tell you the opposite is true. Totalitarian leaders are people we should take more seriously. Leaders in democratic countries like presidents in America will say any number of things to get elected and then change their tune later. Totalitarians don't care what their electorate thinks because they're not elected by them. If the people disagree, they have them killed. A guy like Hitler is ideologically incredibly consistent. What he says about Jews is remarkably similar in 1933 to the last thing he says about Jews before he puts a bullet through his head in his bunker in Berlin in April of 1945. We're going to look at a series of quotes from Adolf Hitler. These are not taken from that propaganda book you all know that he wrote in prison in Germany in the 1920s, Mein Kampf. These are taken from a series of books. Hitler Speaks, Hitler's Table Talk, Hitler's Apocalypse. Many of them are conversations recorded by people like Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal private secretary, and conversations between Hitler and his close confidants and allies. He doesn't have to talk about the propagandizing big stuff, the big lies and stuff. He can focus on what's really going on in his brain and drives his incredibly evil worldview. Let's begin by looking at some of these quotes. The struggle for world domination will be fought entirely between us, between Germans and Jews. All else is facade and illusion. Behind England stands Israel, and behind France, and behind the United States. Even when we have driven the Jew out of Germany, he remains our world enemy. Now, Hitler doesn't look at the Jews as a physical enemy. He looks at them as an ideological enemy. Hitler realizes for the whole first part of World War II, from through 39, through 40, that whole period of time, he's fighting a war against Western liberal democracies. And he recognizes that, especially if you watch the World Perfect stuff we did in the previous class, and we'll talk about it later, that the ideology, the foundational ideology of Western liberal democracy overwhelmingly comes from Jewish thought. And Hitler, being a true intellectual who is consistent, what he says is what he does, will act accordingly. Think about it. 1944. Fall of 44, Hitler has a choice. Send trains. Remember, he's lost Stalingrad, his first major defeat. Now the Soviet army's on the move, pushing him back, ultimately to defeat. He can take trains and send German soldiers to stop the advancing Soviet army, or he can forget that and take trains and send 500,000, 500,000 Hungarian Jews, the last great Jewish community of Europe, of Western Europe, to their death in Auschwitz. What does he choose to do? Kill the Jews in Auschwitz, kill Hungarian Jews. Militarily, what would we call that? Stupidity and suicide. But ideologically, he's being totally consistent. He goes on to say, do you now appreciate the depth of our National Socialist movement? Can there be anything greater and more all-comprehending? Those who see in National Socialism nothing more than political movement know scarcely anything of it. It is more even than a religion. It is the will to create mankind anew. Whoa. He's saying this is more than Nazis and National Socialism is not just a political thing. It is a hashkafa. It's a worldview, so to speak. He goes on to say they refer to me as an uneducated barbarian. Yes, we are barbarians. We want to be barbarians. It is an honorable title to us. We shall rejuvenate this world. This world is near its end. Hitler idolized two things in the Nazis: the Roman Empire pre-Christianity and the Teutonic, Nordic, Viking kind of stuff, like Wagner, the Ring of the Nibelung, the Ride of the Valkyries, that kind of stuff. That brutal stuff that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. He goes on to say, Providence has ordained. Notice, as he said in the previous quote, I'm saving the world. Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I'm freeing man from the restraints of an intelligence that has taken charge, from a dirty and degrading self-mortifications of a false vision called conscience and morality, and from the demands of a freedom and a personal independence which only a very few can bear. Notice how, first of all, we got to shatter an illusion often created by Hollywood that evil thinks it's doing evil and is happy it's doing evil. Evil, by the way, always thinks it's doing good. Hitler is sure he is saving the world. But what's he saving the world from? Look at that, what I've highlighted, a false vision called conscience and morality. Look what he says now. The 10 Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish like circumcision. It's a scar. By the way, who first goes after circumcision in human history? The Greeks. The pagan Greeks in the Hanukkah narrative, which is not, by the way, the Greeks declaring war against Jews. It's paganism's war against the only monotheistic faith in the world, and they outlawed circumcision as a sign of this Jewish monotheistic faith. This is unbelievable. Okay, this is the greatest backhanded compliment ever given to the Jewish people. But the next quote is the most important. It's not a quote from Hitler. It's the words of the Hitler Youth song. This is what every German kid is singing from 1933 to 1945. The last 7 words of this song, I think, are the 7 most important words to understand not only Nazi Germany, Hitler's ideology, but really what's ultimately behind all of anti-Semitism. Excuse me. We are the joyous Hitler Youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior. The Pope and Rabbi shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again. Boom, hiding right out there in plain sight. We want to be pagans once again. Now, in this quote, which you can read along as I'm speaking, Hitler is basically saying that nature is brutal, but nature is balanced. If you ever watch one of these nature shows, I mentioned in the last class, when a lion attacks the herd, it goes for the weak or the sick animals. Lions not being psychotic or psychopathic or evil. The lion's being natural and smart. But nature's brutal, but nature's balanced. The weak and the sick animals are culled out of the herd. That's the herd stays strong, the lions stay strong. This is how it used to be in the ancient world. Babies, we saw in the previous presentation, World Perfect, with a minor birth defect were left out on a rock to be exposed to the elements or beaten by a wild animal. Weak nations were destroyed by the strong. But now he said the world is like a safari park. You ever seen an animal raised in a safari park? A lion raised in a safari park, it looks like natural environment because it's got a big fence and maybe grass, but the lion gets thrown a steak every day by the safari park keeper. Take that lion that's never lived out in the wild and stick it in the wild. What happens to it? Boom, it becomes lunch. So too, today we see in the world that weak nations are allowed to survive, handicapped people are allowed to live. This isn't fair. The human species is being weakened. It's not natural. We need to return the world to its natural state. It's tough, but it's the healthy state to be. And who's responsible for doing that? What's called the human concept of destroying the world. Who's the greatest enemy of humanity? The Jews. And look what he said. If only one country, for whatever reason, tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family becomes the germ center. Hitler calls Jews a virus or bacteria for fresh sedition. If one little Jewish boy survives without any Jewish education, with no synagogue and no Hebrew school, it's in his soul. Even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school in the Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the very beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it. Whoa. He said this, a natural state, the human concept, which has destroyed the natural concept, is a byproduct of the Jews. And it's not a byproduct of rabbis and Jewish education and synagogues and day schools. Every Jew, even a totally disconnected Jew, has a unique soul that will always push some Jewish-based agenda, which is fatal to humanity, onto the world if they're given an opportunity to do so. And therefore, he comes to a very logical, consistent, but evil conclusion that if every Jew's goddess, no matter how, and you can spot the famous ones in here, then every single Jew has to die. Wow. What's interesting is he goes on to say the heaviest blow which ever struck humanity is Christianity. Bolshevism, which is communism, is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew. And by the way, it's true historically and ideologically that Christianity is an offshoot theologically and historically from Judaism and communism and all Marx and you name it, that these ideologies are all created originally by Jews and foisted largely on the world by Jews. But Hitler says to get rid of these, what he calls the bastard children, Christianity and Bolshevism, communism. You just kill Hitler was rabidly anti-Christian. He just didn't survive long enough to get rid of Christianity. Get rid of the priests, get rid of the Pope, get rid of the commissars, get rid of Stalin, and those offshoot bastard children will disappear. We can turn those people back into pagans. But to get rid of the mother of the bastard children, which is Judaism, you can't just kill the rabbis, burn down the synagogues and day schools. Every Jew is bacteria. Every Jew has to die. Wow. What's interesting is what the rabbis in the Talmud say. In the Talmud, now we Jews become a nation in a very unusual set of circumstances. Everyone else in the world becomes a nation by living for a long period of time in a specific piece of real estate, developing a shared historical experience, common borders, and a common culture, and emerges a nation. We become a nation outside our national homeland, in the desert, at Mount Sinai, when we pledge allegiance not to a flag, but to a certain national historic mission, which we talked about in the previous class that we'll get back to. The rabbis in the Talmud say, don't read it as Sinai, which in Hebrew is Sinai, Mount Sinai, where that happened, where we accept our mission nationally. Read it as Sinai, hatred. At Mount Sinai, anti-Semitism was born. It is hatred of the messenger, us, the Jewish people, because of the message we carry in our soul. And even if the messenger forgets the message, like a totally assimilated and educated Jew, you notice the hater of the message, Hitler didn't say, okay, Jews who are assimilated, even intermarried, you're fine, it's just the religious ones. He comes after everyone. Wow, interesting stuff. Hermann Rauschning, who was a close associate of Hitler, who became an anti-Nazi and fled to America, he says it beautifully in this quote. And you can read along as I'm talking now. But the last part he talks about how Judaism is an intrinsic part of Western worldview, Christian worldview, and it's the call to Sinai against which humanity again and again rebels. Boom, he nails it. It's a rebellion against the call to Sinai. What's the call to Sinai? What have we been calling for? And again, we spoke about this in the first class, but we're going to go over it again now. Our job as a people it's, by the way, Torah and mitzvot, I can't say this enough, super important, but they're a means to an ends. Our job is to be a light to nations, to do what's called Kiddush Hashem, to live and act in a way that inspires other people, to take the system, the values we get from a relationship with God, and live individually and collectively as a society that is a role model for the rest of the world. That has always been our mission. And even though, as I always say, it's interesting, there's a famous expression, they won the battles but lost the war. We lost the battles but won the war. Okay, the Greeks, we fought to a standstill in the Hanukkah story, but with the Romans, they trashed us. We lost our country. We went into exile multiple times. We were battered around the world. But we basically, as T.R. Glover, the historian, is saying here, thousands of years, directly or indirectly, we transformed a world which largely hated us into following our worldview. Whether it's through Christianity, Islam, modern liberal democracy, but here specifically we're talking about how large parts of the world dropped that ancient polytheistic worldview that was so prevalent when we were the only monotheists, and now have accepted a worldview and a value system that basically is coming from the Jewish people. Look what John Adams, second president of the United States, says about the Jews. In spite of Bolingbroke and Voltaire once says, the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They're the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire are but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. Or look what British historian Paul Johnson says about the Jews. Certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Think about it. Hitler reading these quotes from Adams and Johnson, would he agree or disagree? He would agree with them more or less. But what's the difference between Hitler on one hand and Paul Johnson and John Adams on the other? They all see the historically proven fact that the Jewish people have directly or indirectly completely transformed the world's vision and values. Their difference is their reaction to it. Paul Johnson and John Adams think it's great. They say the positive stuff. Hitler sees it's evil, or sees that it is evil in his mind. Adolf Hitler is not evil because of his understanding of the Jew. Hitler understands what the Jew is and the Jewish mission better than most Jews. He's evil because of his reaction to it. I see the power of the Jewish people and Jewish ideas to transform the world, and I'm profoundly threatened by it, and we got to get rid of it. This is what you want to take away from this whole class, is this quote from an excellent book. This quote came out of the book. The book came out at the same time as this presentation. Same title even, really interesting, no accidents. Prager and Telushkin, I think this is the best book written explaining the why of anti-Semitism. They say from its earliest days, the raison d'etre of Judaism has been to change the world for the better. This attempt to change the world, to challenge the gods, religious or secular, of societies around them, and to make moral demands upon others has constantly been a source of tension between Jews and non-Jews. We now understand why so many non-Jews have regarded the mere existence of Jews, no matter how few, as terribly threatening. The mere existence of Jews with their different values and allegiances constituted a threat to the prevailing order. Simply put, we have been dragging the world kicking and screaming towards a vision of values based on one God and one absolute standard of morality. And anti-Semitism, regardless of what excuse it will hide behind, ultimately this is the cause. And to this cause we have to direct our efforts if we want to cure that disease. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, has a great quote. He said, a human being can survive anyhow as long as he has the proper why. Meaning people will go through tremendous pain and even give their lives if they appreciate what they're suffering or dying for is meaningful. And that is the story of the Jewish people. If you are watching this today as a Jew, it's only because for generations we had ancestors who were beaten, oppressed, taxed, expelled, burned at the stake, mass murdered. But the last thing out of their mouth was Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. We appreciate that on a macro level. We don't have to worry. This is a t-shirt I created to illustrate this point. Now, it says civilizations, nations, and empires that have tried to destroy the Jewish people and their status today. And we go through all of them, and they're all gone. What I wrote at the bottom is the real message for the non-Jewish world. The Jewish people, the smallest of nations, but with a friend in the highest of places, so be nice. If you want one of the t-shirts, you can go to my website. But on a macro level, we're going to outlast them all. Doesn't mean we're not under threat here. But we've outlasted. We saw them all. We beat them all, as the famous writer Mark Twain said. What we got to worry about is on a micro level, because a potentially very dangerous immediate consequence of anti-Semitism, besides God forbid being attacked physically for being a Jew, is taking a Jew who is ignorant and exposing that Jew who has no Jewish pride, who doesn't know what our mission is to anti-Semitism, because that Jew might decide to make the worst possible decision, which would be what? Assimilation. And why is that so bad? Let me end with one final analogy. Imagine you have, and many of you I'm sure are parents, you have a cute little redheaded girl who goes off to preschool the first day, and she comes home crying, Mommy, Daddy, they made fun of me. They called me Carrot Top and Rudolph the Red-Headed Reindeer. What are you going to say to your daughter? This is PET, Parent Effectiveness Training. You're going to grab your daughter, give her a big hug, a big kiss. You're going to tell her they're jealous, you're beautiful, you have a great future as a stop sign. Anything positive. What would be the one thing you're not going to want to tell your kids? Tell your daughter, dye your hair. There's something wrong with you. The biggest mistake we could make as Jews to think that there's something wrong with us and we need to dye our hair. What does dyeing our hair mean practically? Opting out of Judaism. First of all, if you do that, you break the chain. And everything our ancestors did to get us where we are today was for nothing. Second of all, it doesn't work. One of the scariest supernatural aspects of anti-Semitism is, since the hatred of most groups is because they're different, So the more we become like the non-Jews, the less the hatred should be. We see the opposite is true, that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have taken place in places where Jews are not most different, but most alike non-Jews. We see it in Egypt 3,300 years ago. We see it in Spain before the expulsion in 1492, in Poland before the Khmelnytsky massacres in the 17th century, and in Germany before the Holocaust. And I think the not subtle message is there that our role in history is way too critical. And when a critical number of us start to opt out, I don't know the algorithm, but maybe we should figure it out. That's when, from we least expect it, boom, the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism. I ain't going to make predictions about America, although someone once told me this kind of scary joke about America. He said, Jews in America is like the guy jumping off the Freedom Tower. 50 stories down, he looks in a window and says, so far, so good. Not making predictions, but we can never, ever think we are safe living, especially anywhere in the diaspora, or turn our back on what our mission is. The person who said this the best, and sometimes the clearest and most profound statements are the short ones, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, early 19th century. Put this on your refrigerator, because this is a piece of wisdom you should look at daily. When Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. Now, Kiddush and Havdalah are the ceremonies we make at the beginning and the end of the Sabbath over the wine. Kiddush is when we come from the lower 6 days of the week, the lower spiritual level, and entering that higher day of Shabbat, that higher spiritual reality, the ideal state the world's supposed to be in. At the end, we go down to the lower day with Havdalah. That's not what he means. He says when we do not fulfill our mission that I mentioned before, the purpose of being Jewish is not to serve God. You can't do anything for infinity. It's only a figure of speech. Okay? All the stuff that we talk about, prayer, mitzvot, it's very important, but the job of being Jewish is Kiddush Hashem, to live and act in a way that inspires other people, to fill the world with values, to lead by example, that values that come from God. In physics, we know that nature abhors a vacuum. Vacuums will be filled by one thing or another. Either we, as the Jewish people, directly or indirectly, will fill the world where, regardless of where we're living, but certainly in the Jewish state as a collective, fill the world with the values that come from God that we saw in World Perfect, and give the world a working model of how to actualize those values, or the values, or the world will be filled with the opposite values. When the opposite values come into the world, those opposite values are evil, and evil will always target us first, which is why you can literally tell how countries are doing in terms of their morality and their values by how they treat their Jews. Anti-Semitism will start with us. When a country is moving towards totalitarianism or violence, it'll start with the Jews, then spread to everyone else. When a country where Jews are being treated fairly and equally is almost always a country that is a stable, liberal, democratic country. And George Gilder, who wrote the book The Israel Test, which is a fantastic book, he's not Jewish. He said the same thing. He said, just as Jews within a country are the measure of that country's values and morality, Israel, the Jewish state, is the Jew amongst the nations. Show me what a country thinks of Israel. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. I'll tell you all about their human rights and democracy. Evil targets us first. And therefore, the only solution to anti-Semitism is for us to put our differences aside. You notice that the people who hate us do not distinguish between our political affiliation, our religious affiliation. There's only one line in one of these death camps for all Jews. Put our differences aside. Focus on what we have in common and become, as individuals and collective, this model. God knows the world needs values and role models today. And to create a Jewish people and a Jewish state that's a nation that's a light to nations, and that finishes the job that Abraham started 3,700 years ago. And I know it sounds like the impossible dream, but look at how much we've changed the world. Like as we saw David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, saying a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. And when we focus the incredible energy and drive together on what is our national historic mission, then we will get an end to Israel bashing, an end to anti-Semitism, and peace, not just for ourselves, but for the entire human race. And we should merit to see that soon and in our days. And thank you very much. And as I said before, let me get out of stop the sharing. We even went over time. I apologize for so much information. Thanks for joining us on our Project Inspire MindFlex mini-series. You're welcome to visit my website, which is kenspiro.com. You can access all my material and all online for free. And if you want to read the book that really encapsulates this whole series, it's my newest book, which is called Destiny, Why a Tiny Nation Plays Such a Huge Role in Human History. We're going to be back with one more class Israel and Ishmael, going into the real roots of the Middle East conflict.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.